Welcome to our Caribbean Books Foundation's Conversation Series for 2023. This year, we will post a session every Friday in March at 6 p.m. on the topic of self-publishing in the Caribbean. This week, we welcome Latoyaa Roberts, our editor from Tobago. She will talk to you about how to self-publish a poetry book. The feature will be posted on YouTube tomorrow at 6 p.m. Let us look at Books by LR. Books by LR works with self-published authors every step of the way. She is an editor, copywriter, and writes articles. She also provides book planning consultancy services where she helps you every step of the way. Latoyaa can be contacted at 732-7630 or by emailing booksbylatoyaroberts@gmail.com. We welcome Latoyaa as she speaks on how to self-publish a poetry book.
Hi, I'm Latoyaa Roberts, owner and founder of Books by LR, and also a self-published author and an editor. I'm going to chat with you for a few minutes about what it takes to self-publish your own book, and specifically I will discuss with you the writing process that I did to publish a poetry book. So writing is something that I always encourage persons to do. But only within the last 3 years, I have really focused on honing my writing skills and sharing that knowledge and those tips with others through my founded company, Books by LR. We provide a series of services that include reviewing your manuscript, discussing your writing ideas, and also editing and proofing. Ideally, we take your book from idea to a completed published book. My process is very similar to what I do with my clients daily. In the pandemic, I had some free time that encouraged me to sit and reflect a little bit more about my life and the issues around me. And I decided to express it via poetry. Now, sometimes poetry is looked at as an acquired taste or acquired interest, but I will say that poetry comes the same way that you want to write a long manuscript. For me, it was about generating first my ideas. So I got a paper and I just put broad topics down that I would like to turn into poems. So I featured things such as my life in Tobago, things that I want or aspire to do as a lady. I love traveling, so I jotted down points on my passion for traveling. And I also am a part of various civil society organizations, so I jotted down the interests that I have in there. So my first advice to you, step one, write down, jot down your ideas. They don't have to be coherent, they don't have to flow in any way, but you just have to start putting it down on paper. So for each idea, I put it on a blank sheet of paper. And then once the idea was on a blank sheet of paper, I started to think about the idea a little bit more. Some of my pieces I wrote while I was sitting at home. Others I wrote when I was busy doing other work. I was multitasking. Some I went to a quiet writing space to do it. So sometimes it was outside in nature. I went to the beach. I went to a park. Others it was after discussion with families and friends. The ideas flowed to me. Some pieces I ended up writing in 10, 15 minutes. Other pieces took me a whole day. So my second tip to you is, in your writing process, sometimes the ideas will come quickly. Other times it will take a while to come. But you just have to have the idea and keep thinking about it. Keep having it in your mind, having it in your thoughts. Look at the issues and the things around you, and then they will come. When my poems started to take shape, I also looked at other poetry books. to see how other authors, their poem structure looked, to see what was the rhyming pattern, to see how long the poems were, if they were extremely long or if there were some short poems in between. Did all the poems have to rhyme? Did all the poem have like 3 4 standards, or some poems was just one long large block? So I looked at those different writing patterns to make sure that I can also give variety in my book, to make sure that I have different types of interests and types of poems in the book that will appeal to the reader. You don't have to be a literary fanatic or a structured person as it relates to literature or poetry or spoken word to definitely write a poetry book. But look at a few spoken word pieces, look at a few poems online, look at a few YouTube videos with different persons in poetry and the different contexts and the different types of poetry that they've been emphasizing. And then you can see the patterns and the interest that benefits you to put into your book. So definitely point 3 is look for different poems or poets that you could possibly pattern some of your poetry into. Point 4, poetry is a very acquired taste. So for me, I wrote my poetry book because I had a passion and an interest in poetry, and I found a poetry community that will receive that. Out of all the genres of books, it is often told that poetry books are very hard to sell. So therefore, you need to find that community that will appreciate your writing and have a space for poetry to be found and to be used. Because if your main aim is to write a poetry book for sale, if you do not have a set audience to capture with your poems, with your poetry, it may not be that lucrative if your main goal was to make money off of it. And also you may find difficulty finding an audience to receive your book, to understand and appreciate your book. So point 4 is definitely look for that community that is interested in the work that you have to offer, whether it's a spoken word group, a poetry club, a place that appreciates literature and they have whether poetry nights or they engage in dialogue about poems and poetry, whether physically or virtually, to ensure that you have that encouragement and that motivation along the way in specifically writing a poetry book. Step 5, I will say, is once your book is compiled, you have all your poems together, send out a sample reader. What I did in my case is I selected about 5 out of my book of about 70 poems, and I shared them with friends to get feedback. And I chose variety of poems based on my listing of poems in my book. I chose poems that were very short, about 2 standards, to poems that were a bit longer with about 5 standards. I chose some poems that were in a paragraph block format, also to make sure and get people different appreciation for the different types of poems. And I sent it to about 10 friends and I asked them to read it and asked them what they think about it. Is this something that you're interested in? Which one did you enjoy? Which structure you liked most, which you didn't like? Sometimes it's really good to have that initial market feedback just to guide you along the way and also to generate more ideas about the work that you're doing. And by me sending those poems out to friends, I really got great feedback on the things that I wanted to do and also incorporated some changes where needed, and it became a great way to start to sensitize people, your friends and your networks, that you're working on this product, you're working on this book, and hopefully when it's completed that they will support the work. So that brings me to step 6 now. You definitely need to do a book launch. I will say a poetry book is a nice type of product that you're putting out into the market, and you can do your book launch in probably a poetry reading session. For me, I launched during COVID, so as a result of that, I held a 4-part series online where I featured different persons to come and read my poems and engage in my poems and talk about literature and poems. And that was a really nice way for me to share a piece of my work with the wider audience, to build an interest and regenerate a passion and love in poetry. And it was also good for me to network with other persons who are in the industry, who are within the spoken word field, within the poetry field, and who are interested in this type of work. So you can either do an online launch, or you can do probably like a poetry reading session, or anything that you think will give voice. Because the thing about poetry is, unless you really give voice to reading poems, unless you really give it's where somebody's really reading and enacting the feeling associated with poetry. Sometimes a poetry book is really hard to sell. It's not like a normal novel that everyone will just pick up and read it, but it's really about getting those poetry off the ground with people interested in it, and then hopefully your book could grow from there. So step 6, definitely think a little bit about how you would learn to launch your book. Ensure there is some reading element there, because poetry is all about reading it and putting voice to it to be heard, and then really getting that crowd to follow you. Generally, writing a poetry book is not difficult. My entire process took me about 2 months. Some persons' process could take them up to a few years. I will say, once you have your passion, you have your interest, just start writing. You wouldn't know how well your poetry book will do. You wouldn't know how well you will grow your poetry book until you decide to start writing. So, 2 bonus tips. Persons often ask me how many poems should go in a collection of poems. And that's an interesting point. I think ideally you don't want your book too thin. So I say maybe 50 to 75 poems might be good. And again, it depends on your flair, the topics that is used in your poetry book. For me, I had 5 thematic areas. They span across women in society, civil society movements, inspiration and motivation, love for travel, and life in Tobago. And along those 5 thematic areas, I had about 10 to 15 poems each within the thematic area. So when you're creating a collection of poems, think about the thematic areas that you want in your collection, and how that thematic area going to come together to tell a story, to make a packaged collection of poems. I would never tell anyone that 20 poems is too little, but just bear in mind, you need to make sure there's substance and there's interest to keep a reader engaged in your poems. You may not want to just have a whole book of love. That might be a bit overwhelming for the reader, but you may want to split the broad idea of love into romantic love, then love for family, love for human being and mankind, a more platonic kind of love. You might have a love-hate relationship going on and you want to describe that within your poems. But really think about the thematic areas that you would want to encompass when doing your collection of poems, and then you will make it flow. The next bonus tip I have is, how to really structure or organize your book in the end. I think everybody have their own passion and their flow. Once you start writing and you have your poems together in the thematic area, you will really know, if I really like this poem, I want this person to read this poem first, or this poem, it's okay, it's not the best, it's not the strongest, I'll put it in the middle, or I really want the book to end with this poem because people might remember it when they read it last. Or if it's a lengthy poem, you will realize that, okay, maybe let's start with the shorter poems first, and then you build up to the longer impactful poems in the end. I think once you have your poems and you have them in the thematic area, as you build your book, you will know how to group them. A special touch that I did for my book, because I didn't just want it to be about persons reading poems, I worked with a local artist, Mr. Latoyaa Roberts, and he created some artistic pieces, some artwork based on the thematic areas of my book. and those artistic pieces prefaced the section of the book with the poem. So, like for Women in Society, I had two images created that described what was going on in two of the poems. So, The Love of Tobago, I had one that described that. For traveling, I had one that described that. So, I gave him a few of the poems to read so that he could have the concept and the idea about what my poems are about. And then I discussed with him the feelings, the emotions that I would like to be connotated in the artistic pieces that accompanied my book of poems. And in the end, I had 6 artistic pieces that was specially commissioned to be included in my book, and that gave it an additional touch. Because when I was researching different poetry books and looking at how the different books may appear and the outcome of the books, for me, I wanted something unique. I wanted something a little bit different than just only raw poetry. So I decided to merge my passion with poetry and art into one book. And by having those artistic pieces supplement the poems in the book, it really gave an additional touch to the book, an additional side, an additional feeling to the book that could really help propel my book. And yes, I am a lover of art. I do collect a lot of art, so, and I am a part of a art association. So it was easy for me to really work with the artist and express my feelings and my overall wanting to include art as part of the book and appreciation. So that is a little tip, also a bonus of something different that you can do in your book to make your book stand out, to make your book probably reach a wider audience, to make your book a bit more receptive to the readers instead of reading static poetry throughout your book. So that's my tips on how you can definitely create your own poetry book. And I look forward to hearing from persons about their writing process, especially towards creating poetry books. What are your thoughts, your ideas about poetry? Is it essential? Is it useful? If poetry is something that's long gone and persons are no longer interested in poetry anymore, or has poetry evolved to the different types that you can have in poetry, whether it's more of a spoken word feel, more of a rap feel to your poetry work? I'm really interested in hearing about you. My name is Latoyaa Roberts Thomas. I am the owner of Books by LR. I'm a self-published author and I am also an editor, and I do help persons go through their self-publishing process towards writing their book. And before I close, I'd just like to share with you a few works from some of my clients. It's not only about me, but it's really about supporting others who go through the writing process and their wishes and their wants for their writing goal. So this first book is from a lady based in Trinidad, and she is actually a cancer survivor, and her book has to do with her journey towards the cancer recovery process, the treatment and recovery process. And this is a really touching book because it's not only her life story, but it's really a motivation book that could really help persons who are going through that process. So Dancing with the Red Devil by Pearl Balagru, sorry. I really hope persons do look out for a copy of that book. I've also worked with Makeda James. She is working on educational books. This book is called First Choice, and it's for students who are doing the C exam in Trinidad and Tobago, really making mathematics a bit easier to understand for persons. So you can definitely check out this book on Amazon. And lastly, I would like to share with you a copy of my book, a collection of poems by Latoyaa Roberts that emphasizes poetry along 5 thematic areas that cover women in society, NGO movements, definitely my passion for travel, also my love for Tobago, and inspiration and motivational poems. I look forward to hearing more about persons' writing processes. I'd also like to thank Caribbean Book Foundation for this exciting opportunity to share with others as we continue to encourage, especially Caribbean writers, to write your ideas down. Not only leave them on pen and paper or on a tablet, but definitely go through the process towards publishing your book and sharing it with the world.
Thank you for tuning in to our conversation series. Next week, Friday, we will continue to look at self publishing in the Caribbean. Feel free to share and post comments and they will be answered. This is Caribbean Books Foundation, where the world meets Caribbean literature.